The 25th anniversary of the Columbine shooting, chaos over Pastor Mark Driscoll and a sword swallower, and Bill Maher's shocking comments about abortion. We're breaking down these stories and much more on today's Higher Ground with Billy Hallowell. I'm Billy Hallowell, and I'm joined today by Jesse Jackson from Church Leaders and Valerie Richardson from the Washington Times. We've got a lot to discuss on the show. As you know, just as a reminder, Higher Ground, our new format. We do things here unlike any other faith podcast. We are bringing together some of the best TV hosts, reporters, commentators, you name it, to take you behind the story and dive deep on the biggest stories each week. With no further ado, let's welcome Jesse and Valerie to the show. So Valerie and Jesse, a lot to break down today. We're going to start with this Bill Maher story because I never know what to make of Bill Maher. One minute he's saying things that I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? And the next he's making sense and I'm like, this is really interesting. But Val, he recently said something that shocked a lot of pro-lifers about abortion. Take us through the story.
Yeah, he shocked them on both sides of the shocking spectrum, because on the one hand, they were horrified by what he said, and on the other hand, they appreciated it, because what he said was that he thinks that abortion is killing babies. He was talking about President Trump's stance, which is now, leave it to the states, and he says he sort of countered that by saying, oh, you mean killing babies is okay in some states? And then he said he can respect what he called the absolute position, which I assume means absolute pro-life position. And he said, he doesn't believe that pro-lifers hate women. He thinks they honestly think that abortion is murder. And then he said, it kind of is. Those are his words. It kind of is. And then he said, I'm okay with that. It's just that I'm okay with that because I think there are too many people in the world. That's his position. So it was there was a lot to There was a lot there, and I think that the main reaction I saw from pro-life groups was Bill Maher says the quiet part out loud. He actually said, somebody who is pro-choice, that abortion is murder, and they appreciated the honesty. Obviously they didn't like the fact that he seemed okay with that. The whole depopulation stance, but yeah, it was a moment. It was definitely a moment in the zeitgeist to hear someone like Bill Maher, who's this prominent, to say that, because you will never hear that from the pro-choice movement.
Yeah, I mean, gosh, Jesse, what is your take on this? Because we've all seen a million people talk about abortion, and I feel like most of the time they're trying to, on the pro-choice side, dance around the idea that this is murder or killing or even death.
Right. Yeah, I think what's really interesting, as I was listening, to just unpacking that, what came to my mind is, isn't it interesting that you have somebody agreeing the fact that it's murder, but is also okay with it happening? I think it really tells us where we are in our nation right now, and in just the world in general, probably, of just how dark it really is. Murder's okay as long as it's a baby. It's okay. So that's kind of, as I'm just processing that, that's crazy.
Yeah, no, it is. And Val, you brought up obviously how both sides, or how pro-lifers were shocked on both ends, and it is really interesting to me because you have this factor of the belief that a lot of pro-lifers have, that people on the pro-choice side lie about this issue. They pretend they don't think it's life, even when they know it is. These are the arguments you'll hear. And to have somebody say, well, I'm not going to lie about it. It's death and killing, and I'm okay with it. I know there have been people in the past, and they've been considered fringe when they've said this, when they've admitted that, in medical journals and other places. But I mean, have you seen a lot of other people take this position in your coverage of these issues?
No, this is almost unheard of. I mean, that was what was so stunning about it. I think that I think though that Bill Maher may be sort of one step ahead of the culture, as he often is, in the sense that medical science and research is really helping the pro-life side. Babies can be saved at much earlier points in gestation at this point, and yet you have states out there that basically allow abortion through the third trimester, well past when a baby can be saved if it's born prematurely. And so I think he may be sort of one of the pro-life groups said he's basically giving us the uh, framework for fighting back, as LifeSite News put it, but he's also sort of uh, telling the pro-choice side, look, you're going to have to get used to the idea that people are going to increasingly accept this as murder because of, in part because of, the scientific advances,
Hmm.
and you're going to have to deal with that.
Wow.
I think he had a
Gosh.
message for both sides.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, you're left with only that. I mean, it's really interesting because if the science does validate that, then and we've all been covering this forever, we know that's true. The
Hmm.
science is validating that this is life, that when that happens, if you have that position, you have to at some point, and that's so interesting what you said about being a step ahead. You have to then say, well, this is what this is, and if you're going to advocate for it, you've got to be comfortable with saying that. Any final words on this one, Jesse?
Yeah, I mean, Val's spot on. This is if this is the future for the pro-choice movement and the disregard for life, um, it's just setting up, for things that are outside of the womb. To be honest with you, if we're going to be a nation that is going to be sitting right there, then what's the next step? How bad will it get when we're dealing with this stuff? That's crazy.
Well, I lied because I said last word, but I guess I'll throw something in. I covered the Gosnell case, and I was in Pennsylvania for that, and was in the courtroom pretty frequently, not every day. But I kept thinking during that case, pulling myself back from any personal opinion on the issue, and looking at it, thinking, okay, this guy is on trial, and what he did was horrific, being accused at the time of snipping the spines of babies once they were out of the womb. If you don't know the Gosnell case
Hmm.
as a listener, you should go and read about it. He's in prison for life over this case, but basically babies were being born, then their spines were being snipped, and it was allegedly easier for him as an abortion doctor to do the abortions that way after birth, after birthing them out, than it was to follow the protocol, which, like it or not, of what an abortion was, in utero. And so just really horrific. But I kept thinking during that case, and I even wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post about this at the time, actually, because I was so shocked by being there. It's the difference of a couple of inches, right? If you're
Hmm.
8
Yeah.
months pregnant and you can have an abortion, or you deliver at 8 months a little early, it would be illegal to kill that baby out of the womb. It would not be illegal in places like New York, where I live, to have that abortion and 5 minutes beforehand. And that really rocked me, just
Hmm.
looking at this issue. It really did.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. The Gosnell
So
case was incredible. And one thing I do think is a lot of people have forgotten about it. It got a lot of publicity, but not as much as perhaps, the pro-life side would have liked to see. It didn't get as much publicity as you might have seen in, under different political circumstances. And I do think that one thing you've got going on right now is states, including red states, are seeing these ballot measures hitting the initiatives that are basically placing the right to abortion in the state constitutions. And I the fear is that you're going to see more Gosnell situations, because it's going to severely limit the ability of the state to place restrictions. In some cases, there's people on the other side are saying that the state might not even be able to, conduct health investigations or examinations of these places, or follow up on, allegations of wrongdoing, because it's going to be in the Constitution. There's a lot of concern about that. So
Hmm.
that is
wow.
one fear on the pro-life side. That's for
Wow.
sure.
That
Wow.
that is just, they clearly weren't even doing their job in Pennsylvania. Yeah, I mean, if they were, then Gosnell wouldn't have been able to continue operating for as long as he did, the way he was, right? And that was
Hmm.
before all of this current chaos, when that
Right,
case
right.
happened back in 2013, right? So, well, there's a lot more. Well, I'm sure we'll be talking more about this issue many times, because there's so much to unpack on it. But I'm going to shift over to you, though, Jesse, because this story, you and I have talked a lot offline about it, and
Hmm.
everybody in the Christian world is aware of this. It is one of the most bizarre stories, involving Mark Driscoll being kicked off of a stage at a men's conference for calling out a performance. I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to let you explain to us what in the world this viral story is about.
Um, I have been in this story since Monday. I don't know that I've gotten out of it. Talk about rabbit holes. And it is not done. It just keeps going deeper. But yeah, Mark, this was a really big. It's a huge men's conference that It's put on by James River Church, called the Stronger Men's Conference. It's, they just try to be, they do acts, and they have in the past that just kind of like MMA, you know, things like literally at the conference, just as entertainment to say that they're manly men, hence the title. One of the acts that was this year, was an act by Alex. Um, he's he's a performer that has been all over. He's got really known through the American Got Talent world on the multiple different stages, Britain, Russia, you name it. He's been in the American stuff. And in his act, what he does, he climbs up one of these, and you've probably seen them before. They're those like really tall Chinese poles, is what they call them. And you've probably seen like the Cirque du Soleil people use them a lot. I've never been to a Cirque du Soleil act, but I've seen it on TV. And they'll like do the like, you'll see them hang off, and they call it like the flagpole, and they'll look like they're walking upstairs. That's what these poles are used for. Well, it's in the middle of in the arena. Uh, you know, Crazy. I think he comes in on a motorcycle and everything. Real macho looking, and he's got a
Typical church things.
typical, totally Christian men's conference. Like, yeah, I was waiting for John Piper to come out the back, and no, I'm just joking. So he gets up there. Well, he's a sword swallower, so his act, what he does is he swallows this sword, and a real long sword, swallows it, takes his shirt off, so he can grip the pole better, climbs up this like 30-foot pole, so he's like up above the stage lights, and then turns around backwards. So now head first, going to the ground with the sword in his mouth, so the handle's sticking out, and then like literally kind of just free falls all the way down the pole, almost hitting the floor, which would jam the sword all the way up into his, and kill him. Well, he stops right before that. And that was his act. Everybody's going crazy, blah, 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 blah. That was on Friday night. Saturday, or Mark Driscoll then preaches. During his sermon, it wasn't at the very beginning, but during his sermon, Mark gets down on one knee and says, I gotta bring this to, this is not condemning or calling anybody out, but it was an observation. And he goes off, pretty much saying what he observed was, the spirit of Jezebel, which he's been talking about this really ever since Trump got into office, or sorry, Biden got into office. It's not a brand new thing with Mark. And he was saying that the pole was like a stripper pole, and that Alex ripped his shirt off like a stripper, and it was very like demonic. So now, as he was saying that, the lead pastor for James River Church in the audience starts yelling at Mark, and says, "You're out of line. You got to stop what you're doing." Mark is friends with the Lindell family, and has been for many years. I think like 20 years, even since the fallout of Mars Hill, when he was resigned from Mars Hill. I think the Lindell family was very integral in kind of restoring Mark. And Mark even said, I believe that there were things that the Lindell he did. And he spoke letter and said, hey, things in our conversations after the Mars Hill stuff, we built, Mark opened another church called the Trinity Church there in Phoenix, Scottsdale, Arizona. And he built a lot of their conversation, architected it off of that, their church. Now, so again, lots of respect, right, for the Lindell family. Mark receives it, grabs his stuff, leaves off stage. A lot of boos from the crowd, because they liked what Mark was saying. So it kind of seems as though they were agreeing with Mark. So yeah, it was very odd. The video then shows both Pastor Lindell and Mark come back on stage, later on, just like probably 15 minutes or so, because it was like a worship song. Come back on stage, and they sit down and they reconcile. Mark apologizes. Lindell, they talk. They talk about their relationship. Mark says, I should not have done that. I should have asked you first. I should have told you and got your blessing before I said what I said. um, and then you thought that that was it. And that's kind of the
But
main
it
story.
was
That's
not
what
it, because
started.
this is a
Not it
soap
at all.
opera. This is a church soap opera.
That
Continue. I
is
need to hear the rest. Go ahead.
no, that is a very good way to put it. So if you jump then into the next article that I would write, so you just continue to keep going. Um, the next article then goes on to say that Alex then released a statement. The guy from
The sword
AGT,
swallower.
the sword swallower,
Yeah.
he releases a statement saying he's a Christian. What he did was not strip tease, and all of this stuff. Well, in my investigation, as I was looking into who Alex was, I realized that there was some validity, probably unbeknownst to Mark, that kind of what he was saying about Alex being a stripper was not completely wrong. And what I mean by that is I found some articles during his AGT days, American Got Talent days, that he kind of moonlighted or also worked as a stripper, as what they said, in women's nightclubs and gay bars or gay nightclubs. Is what. So I'm like, hmm. So I go on his social media accounts, look through there, and there were some images that confirmed that. Let's put it that way, without getting too
Wow.
graphic in what the images, reveal. So that was that part of that story. Then on Wednesday, the whole thing turned, and a plot twist happened even bigger because James River Church, during their Wednesday night service, called out Mark, went on their live stream, called Mark to repentance. And there were 5 things. You'd have to read the article to kind of see what that is on what they did. I guess Mark, in between that time of his reconciliation on stage, um, went behind kind of their backs a little bit and was talking to the Lindell family individually and trying to cause division, saying that it was demonic what Alex did. It was, a stripper performance. There were some other things that he said, and they just, they tried the Matthew 18 that, and they were at the last thing of the Matthew 18 process, which is to take him before the church, and that's what they did. So yeah, that's kind of where that is.
Wow. Okay. So Val, I know Val's probably like, what? I don't know how much. Val, were you very aware of this story beforehand?
Only very scantily. I wasn't really that aware of it. I had heard a thing or two, but yeah, that's incredible. Like, what a
It's well,
story.
it's well, and it's wild. It's wild. And here's the thing, because at first, when I first heard this story, and we covered it as well. I didn't cover it, but somebody else did. I looked at it and I thought, this is such like a TMZ type thing. But then when you start looking at the key players, these prominent pastors, it actually is a very serious story on a number of levels, in that you've got really big claims being made, right, about all these different elements. But to me, I sort of pulled back on this, and I'd love to get your reactions. You know, and I'm speaking now not as a commentator or a journalist. I'm going to speak as a Christian. I pull
Mhm.
back on this, and I think the biggest issue at the core of all of this is this big question: do we really in churches need monster trucks and sword swallowers and all of these events to get excited about the gospel? I mean, that's the part for me that I'm so stuck on, because I'm like, this is an avoidable crisis on every level, to me at least. Val, I know what you think, Val, but
No, you're right, and it is a good point. You almost think at some level, do Christians not trust God to be able to work without sword swallowers and monster trucks? Do they think he needs to be jazzed up a bit? It does make
yeah.
you wonder. I mean, I understand trying to reach young people and bringing in people who might not normally come, but at some level it sort of seems to show a certain lack of faith.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah.
Jesse, I want to come back to you, but one thing I want to say, like, Mark Driscoll has been controversial. I've interviewed him over the years. I'm sure you have too. Obviously, the falling out you mentioned with his church and all those different things that have happened. So you have this strange dynamic where people are coming in, some of them not liking Mark, but yet saying, well, he had a point, and others saying, no, no,
Mhm.
no, Mark should have gone to this pastor first and aired his grievances to him, not on the stage. So you have all these weird theological issues colliding with this bizarro story about a sword swallower.
Oh,
I don't know.
oh
What's your
yeah.
big takeaway for you, Jesse?
Well, I mean, okay, so yeah, let me kind of play it as you did there, Billy. Like as a Christian looking at this, so not as a reporter or journalist. I'm looking at this from a very high level view. The things that like kind of stick out that I'm still asking the question of is, Mark says that he hears, he sees this thing happen. He goes on stage, the Holy Spirit speaks to him. He wrestles with um, whether he should say something. This is during his sermon before he says something, but then says, "Okay, obviously, I'm gonna follow what the Spirit says." That's when he goes ahead and he, whether he calls it or not, I would call it a rebuke of what happened. And but then in the reconciliation comes back and apologizes for that, and then goes on and kind of sticks to where he's, hey, no, I still think that this was wrong. So it caused a lot of confusion for me, and still kind of does as I'm looking at this from that high level view of like, Mark, why did you come back and reconcile? If you believe that the Holy Spirit told you to do this, and you felt as though that it was truly the Holy Spirit leading you, there would be no reason to reconcile unless you thought
Yeah.
something was completely sinful, but you're sticking to your guns that it wasn't. So that's if that makes sense. I can see where the confusion. If I was looking at it, that's where I would be confused. If that kind of answers your
Yeah.
question.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Yeah.
why we can't have nice things, right? Because people, this is why I feel like as we were talking about, I'm just like, we could have just not done the sword swallow, or
Mhm.
like here's the other thing, and we can leave it here and we'll talk about our it's going to be the most bizarre topic change ever. I should have thought this through better. But when you look at what unfolded there, the discernment, right? If you're going to bring people in, maybe even just checking
Yeah.
in the background, making sure you're not going to have this sort of thing, if you're in the market to hire a sword swallower, which I guess this church was. So,
Yeah.
well, listen, let's go into our final story here. And this is actually one, Val, I know you have a connection to it, because you covered it, but the Columbine high school shooting this year is the 25th anniversary. That shooting happened on April 20th, 1999. It's crazy to think that 25 years have gone by. And full disclosure, a couple of my very close friends, like one of my best friends in the world is Craig Scott, whose sister, Rachel Joy Scott, died at the school that day, and he was in the library. And so, I spent a lot of time this week, hours, talking with Craig, going back through the story. And there are always things, and I've heard him tell the story so many times, that stand out to me, particularly with Rachel Joy Scott, his sister. For those who don't know, she was 17 years old, beautiful teenager who kept journals, and she kept these 7 journals, like a lot of teenagers do, but she was a very strong Christian. And so she talked a lot about her struggles, her faith, her life. And there's some really interesting, and we can't get into all of it on the show here today, but stories about her just feeling like she wasn't going to live a long life, telling her family that, I don't feel like I'm going to grow up and have children. Even as the shooting was approaching, things that she was writing that sort of exposed that she had this feeling that something was going to happen. And also this feeling that she wanted her life to really matter and that she wanted to reach millions of people with her life. That was something she had said throughout her life. And so it's kind of crazy looking back at this horrific event that from a news perspective opened up so many conversations about violence and what sparks mass shootings. I mean, we're still having these fights today, obviously, because these events have not stopped. And that was really the first big one. But then also looking at this human interest story of this girl whose life, I mean, all over the country, Rachel's Challenge, it's based on her name. The family is out there speaking at schools, public schools, not just churches,
Mm.
and churches, and they're out there, and she's having this effect on millions of people as she had always wanted to have. So I'll kind of stop there, Val, because I'd love to hear just your experience having. I was young when the event happened. I was a high school freshman when Columbine happened. So I wasn't covering it at the time, but what was it like for you to be covering that?
It was amazing on that day how normal everything seemed, and I think that that's one of my takeaways from a lot of big events. I got a call from my editor saying, hey, something's happening at this local high school near you. Would you go down there? And it was like 10 minutes from my house. So I did. And they had moved all the students across. There's Columbine High School is located at one end of a very large park. And at the other end of the park is the library. And the students were all in like the library, outside the library in the parking lot, that area, waiting for their parents to pick them up. So I was talking to students. They all knew it was Eric. And they were talking openly about it, and it was really unreal because nobody really, I think, knew exactly what had happened, but you hadn't really seen a huge mass shooting like this before, and people were like, oh yeah, it's Eric, oh my gosh, and just kind of like talking like normal kids would act. And I got some of their phone numbers, and later I tried calling them, and their parents were like, they can't talk about it, they're like in shock now, because at the time it was so unreal. They could talk about it later, it became just too much. But what I was going to say about it is Columbine High School is still there. They renovated it, but they didn't tear down the building. There was a big discussion about that. It didn't happen. There's a big memorial there, as you can imagine, and it is interesting just because I cover politics, so I noticed this. How it has been used for any number of agendas. The one thing that really came out of it initially was these poor guys were bullied and that's why they did this. Well, later on we find out that Eric Harris was essentially a psychopath, and
Yep.
he wasn't this poor put upon kid. He and Dylan had dates for the prom. They were not considered to be kids they did get picked on, but apparently they picked on others too. And yet that bullying narrative, it exists to this day about some of these shooters. Um, and it's a strong narrative, and I understand it, but it also has Colorado did a lot on guns after that. There was a Republican governor at the time, but they did pass some gun restrictions and everything. And I was noticing there was going to be a memorial this weekend, and it's being sponsored by a lot of gun control groups like Colorado Ceasefire and the Brady campaign and that sort of thing. So it continues to feed that narrative as well.
Yeah. Well, Jesse, I want to go to you in a minute, but it's really interesting you brought that up because Craig Scott spoke a lot this week about how the media got it wrong. That the media, they were out there from day one saying that the shooting happened, not because these guys were intentionally trying to hurt everybody and were psychopaths, but because they were bullied and they were trying to get revenge. And he said that was the overall story that came out. And he said, but when you looked at what the psychologists were saying and everybody in the community, that was not accurate, to your point, Val. And
Right.
So it's so crazy though, how a narrative like that, because it actually affects how you fix the situation in the future, how you stop something from happening again in the future. Right. I mean, it's so
I
crazy.
Think what you saw was after that, people were like, we have to do anti-bullying campaigns. And obviously that's, it's a worthy cause, but I don't think that changes Columbine. Eric Harris was a pretty confident kid, and he and Dylan were in the top, AP classes and everything. I like I said, I'm sure he was picked on, but he apparently was also picking on others as well. I don't think an anti-bullying campaign really stops Eric Harris. I think what you got there is much more of a mental health issue. He apparently, according to all the the people who looked at this or the experts, is that he was a psychopath, and he was gonna do something bad apparently, and his parents have never spoken out about it. Dylan's have. Dylan was kind of sort of like the one who got kind of swept up in Eric's sort of aura. And his mother has talked about it. And one thing that comes out of the Dylan story is just how much a stronger personality can influence a teenager. I remember talking to a psychiatrist afterward, and I said, would someone like Dylan, if he's just like a normal kid, could he actually be convinced by this stronger personality that Eric was, this sort of alpha guy, to kill somebody? I mean, if he weren't that inclined that way in the first place? And she says, oh yeah, definitely.
Wow.
Kids are extremely impressionable, and they're not at that point adult moral agents, and it's amazing what apparently they can be convinced to do.
Yeah, absolutely. It's wild. What was your experience or take on that event?
I remember it. It was yeah, it was definitely one of the ones that I remember that was, those type of things never happened. It seemed as though that was one that stuck out. The one thing that I remember from it, and so I would love to ask your guys' opinion on it, because as someone that hasn't covered it as much, I know the story, never really covered it a whole lot. But I know that, but the entertainment, the media, uh, was pegged as a big influence and the reason going into a lot of what happened. So their darkness, I think the two that stuck out to me was their metal music. So Marilyn Manson was one that was big into that, and then also the Matrix because of the way they dressed. You know, how much of that do you think was real that lent itself to them going through and plan of playing that out?
Yeah, Val, I'll let you add to this, but I'll tell you, I'm going to put the interview with Craig in the show notes so people can watch it because it's a fairly long interview where he talks about some of this. I think some of the media came up, in some of the survivors' views, it was really everything that these kids were putting into their minds and their hearts, right?
Mm,
He talked Craig about how, yeah, they were just intent on killing. They had this sick, twisted, all these
Hmm.
dark thoughts. So they were engaging in content that would fuel that. I don't know that you could blame
mm,
the content directly, but it was all part of it, right? They would do all these things and take all these things in, to sort of, corroborate and shape their worldview. So they were attracted to those dark things. And
Right.
he talked very, very fervently about it's not their parents, it's not, all medication, bullying, all these other things that were blamed. It's that they made choices in their heart to engage in these evils, right? I don't know if you
mhm,
want to add to that, Val, but
Yeah,
mhm,
no, I think those are good points. And the other thing I was going to say is that one thing that really came out after Columbine is I want to say it was Time magazine, and I apologize if I'm wrong, but one of the major magazines put Eric and Dylan on the cover, and there was a huge backlash after that. And what came out of that was that then that was basically blamed for inspiring copycats who wanted to be glorified in the way that they saw Eric and Dylan be glorified. And there was an enormous, sort of campaign to stop that. And now what you see in the media is much more of an attempt not to mention the shooter's name, except when absolutely necessary, not to focus on him, not to glorify him or her. It's usually a him. Because I think some of because it was so unusual and nothing like that had happened in years and decades perhaps. It was such an unusual event. It got so much media attention that unfortunately the attention ended up focusing on the shooters when it should have really, most people would agree, focused more on the victims. And I will say
mhm.
there was a lot of attention in Colorado on the victims. Everybody, you could name a name of the victim and people will say, oh yeah, that was one of the Columbine victims. People remember those names.
Mm,
yeah, and I'll say as a final comment, before we close out here too. One of the things, to your point of what you were just talking about, the shooters made it very clear that they wanted to spark a chain reaction of school shootings. That by doing this, they chose the day they chose. I think April 20th is Hitler's birthday, if I'm not
Right.
mistaken. They
Yes.
chose
Hmm.
this day, and they wanted a chain reaction of evil to come out of that. They made tapes talking about all these things. What was
Yeah.
so remarkable, going back to Rachel Joy Scott's story, is at the same time these kids are overtaken by evil and doing this, she's writing in her journal that she wants to create a chain reaction of goodness and love. And
mm,
you had this really strange dynamic, and I think for Christians they would say it's a spiritual dynamic going on,
mhm,
where
Mm.
these kids are saying totally different things. And when you really look at this, some would argue that both things have happened, but you have seen out of Rachel's story incredible, again, she's been used the way that she wanted to, but she was writing those things at the same time they were recording it. And that just really struck me as
Yeah.
so incredibly bizarre, but also encouraging in some ways from a spiritual perspective, that we saw that light and dark fight going on and there was light there still. So I
Mm.
yeah.
appreciate you guys breaking this all down with me today. And we hit a lot of interesting topics today, so appreciate it.
Yes,
No,
thank
thanks,
you.
Billy.
That's all for today's Higher Ground with Billy Hallowell. Make sure you head over to billyhallowell.com. You can sign up for my newsletter where I will send you updates on some of the big stories we're covering at the Washington Times. It'll also include my work over at CBN News, over at Premiere Unbelievable, and all the places that I get a chance to put content out there. So make sure you sign up for that newsletter, billyhallowell.com, and head on over to Higher Ground in the Washington Times for the news you need to read. We'll see you again next week for another episode of the show.